to another segment of Ideas Live. I'm Karen Anderson, and this is my co-host,
Anne-Marie Oomen.
And we have a really important and difficult topic. Just be aware. Today we're going to talk about conflict.
And resolution, if that's possible.
Yes. Recognizing that conflict is not easy for any of us, we thought maybe this would be a really substantive topic to address, and we have a wonderful guest who's not afraid of conflict, unlike Anne-Marie and myself. So we'll be with her in a minute, but first of all, let's talk about why we're so uncomfortable with conflict.
I don't even know where to begin. I do. I think I begin in childhood because, my mother was a powerful woman, and having a conflict with her was emotionally challenging, to say the least. And I think that's where, for me, it starts. And in the household, my father was the quiet person, and so he was the person who backed away from conflict. And what I learned over time was to be circuitous in my approach to conflict, to back off, let it slide, and then work around it in entirely other ways so that I would never, ever have to have that real confrontation.
Because, with your mom.
Yeah, right.
Well, and you think about it, and when we start out with conflicts with parents, there's such a power imbalance.
I think so.
I mean, how often do you ever win a conflict with a parent? I mean, hardly ever. So it's probably not the best beginning to, you start out losing all the time. No wonder we don't like conflict. In my family, conflict was just kind of denied. I mean, we would never use the word.
That's another way.
And if people got angry, people would just get quiet. And then you wouldn't talk to anybody for a day or two, and then suddenly you'd start talking again as if nothing had never happened.
Right.
Which is equally dysfunctional. I mean,
the silent treatment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so years later, a therapist said to me, when I said, "Why am I so bad at resolving conflicts?" He said, "You never ever saw conflict resolved in your own home."
Yes, I think that's right.
Nobody was modeling it.
Or if it was resolved in a win-lose setting where somebody had to completely give over, and there was, I think, for me, some embarrassment and shame and loss of integrity involved in whenever I did see conflict come to an end.
Right, it was a win-lose thing. What about, we should be able, if not with parents, to learn conflict resolution with siblings. Was that any different? You had a bunch of siblings.
I certainly did. But the power imbalance just continued because I was left in charge of them so often. And I think that they are, to some degree, better at conflict than I am because they would just ignore me. But I think the two boys paired, and we called them the little girls paired. And they worked out their differences between them. I was not involved. So I didn't get to practice. And I think that that's something else about conflict that we don't realize. I think people need practice at it. I mean, I think that emotional upwelling that happens when you're in conflict and that anxiety, you have to find, well, I'm making some guesses now because I don't have a lot of experience still. But I think you have to find a way to grapple with that and overcome that emotional sort of tsunami.
Yeah, a framework, something like guidelines within which that emotional anguish can find expression that isn't damaging.
Yes, and that anxiety, I think that the way we want to avoid it all the time. I mean, I certainly do. So I shut down and go my circuitous way. And but I so appreciate when I see somebody in a very calm way say, here's what I'm hearing, and they don't seem they don't internally explode, they don't disappear into
People
dust.
Don't annihilate each other, although, at the national and international level, excuse me, we certainly see conflicts that escalate into violence. And some people see that in their homes. So I think our fear of it is understandable.
I think it is too. but I also don't know exactly how you finally get past that.
That's why we have a guest.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
why don't we look for resolution with our guest and bring her in, and we'll be right back. Hello and welcome back to Ideas Live. I'm Karen Anderson, and my co-host here is
Anne-Marie Oomen.
And we're talking today about conflict. And it's a difficult topic. And fortunately, we have someone who does not find it daunting or intimidating. Our guest, Becky Rogan, who is the director of the Conflict Resolution Services here in Traverse City. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank
Welcome.
you. Thank you.
So glad you're here.
Thank you.
Are you often treated as a guru? And
No.
well then, we want to correct that.
We want to correct that.
Thank you. Thank you.
As we said earlier, we are both a little conflict phobic, and both of us acknowledge this, and we're just eager to talk about how we approach this and why are we so afraid?
Well, that's a good question, Anne-Marie. And quite honestly, I think most people are afraid of conflict. And it comes about often for a couple of reasons. First reason usually is because when we're growing up, conflict tends to become chaos. It's in our homes we see conflict as anger. And it's not that anger is necessarily a bad thing, but oftentimes it's been turned into a bad thing. Then we get the opposite end of that, where we've not seen conflict at all or have not seen it resolved. And both of those represent problems. When you don't see it resolved, you don't know what to do with it. So that's often why people are conflict phobic.
Right.
So,
Gosh.
And you mentioned anger. And the minute you said anger, I right away think it's a negative thing. But I remember when you and I were chatting earlier, you said anger isn't necessarily negative.
Anger's not necessarily negative. It's an emotion like any other emotion, like sadness or like happiness. It's what happens with that anger. What do we do with it? Anger can get us to move. It can get us to do great things. When we see an injustice, oftentimes our first emotion is to get angry at that injustice. And then what do we do with that injustice, that feeling towards that injustice? And for a lot of us, I think it's that we want to correct the injustice. We want to perhaps confront the person that's doing the injustice. And that's okay, as long as we do it in an appropriate and healthy manner, where we're not even putting that other person down as well, where we're saying, hey, that's not an appropriate response. That's not an appropriate behavior. And when we make those corrections appropriately. So it's not a bad thing, but people are afraid of it because oftentimes what we see when we see somebody angry is the inappropriate behaviors. We see people being harmed.
Or we've
Physically and emotionally.
Physically and emotionally.
Yeah.
Or we've been harmed ourselves.
And I've certainly been afraid of my own anger because of my secret fantasies of revenge or hateful feelings.
Yes.
Let's just
Can
say
be
that
in
we
there.
have those.
We have them. They're not hopefully not acted out. But you also mentioned some other emotions that get triggered by conflict, like shame and
Shame, fear. Shame is a huge emotion. When we've been shamed in our past and been told we're not good enough or that we're not worth anything, that's huge.
And I think as we were speaking of it earlier, if the conflict always presents itself as a win or lose situation, then losing at least in our culture, and certainly in my childhood, was associated with being shamed, as being wrong, being inadequate, being the underling, and
person.
that was a place you did not want to be.
Right. And you don't want to lose. Our society is set up as you have to win. We give the winners the big trophy, the blue ribbon.
Right.
And so you don't want to be on the losing end, or you don't get
called a
anything.
loser.
You get called a loser. There is shame in being a loser. And so how you approach resolving conflict is to hopefully not have anyone as a loser, but as both sides seeing how perhaps giving up a little bit of their position brings winning to both sides. And maybe even in some situations, you might have a third party who's not present at the table, like a child. In a lot of the cases that Conflict Resolution Services deals with, it is dealing with parenting time situations. And so you have to remember that it's not just about the parents, it is about that child and what's best for them. And so, and it can be really difficult because those parents love that child. There's no doubt about it. But sometimes they forget the other parent does too because of the conflict the parents are in. And when both of those parents can remember that child in the process and say, okay, I can give up this for my child, then that child wins. And that's really important.
And to me, it seems to me that must be a process that you have to sort of lead step by step.
Absolutely.
I mean, it doesn't seem like, it's not a sitcom situation where the talk changes everything.
Right, right.
In a half hour.
In a half an hour. And most mediations are on average 3 hours, which means some are shorter and some are longer.
Right.
But it is very much a process. And we talk to folks about that process. When we go in, the mediators start out with an opening statement to explain the process, where the mediators will tell the individuals. And in our process, when I talk about mediators, I often use the plural because we try to have co-mediators so that we have two people listening, because oftentimes they're going to pick up on different things. And then the co-mediators will tell the folks, okay, this is the process. As the mediator, I control that process, but as the participants, you control the outcome, which means you control whether or not we come to an agreement today. And if we don't, that's okay. That's your outcome. And then it will continue down whatever path might be ahead of you. That might be court, or that might be you walk out and nothing changes. And then there is a period where the parties each have uninterrupted time. And sometimes this is the first time that the other side has actually had to sit and listen to what their other party has had to say without interrupting them.
I loved it when you were sharing with me before kind of those three things. What I heard you say is that kind of reflective listening. And then, did I get it? And then the best of all, is there more?
Yes.
Because there is almost always more, I'm guessing. But when we're not with a mediator, that you're just waiting to get your turn.
Yes. There's Stephen Covey, I believe, was credited with saying, we often listen to respond, not listen to hear.
Yeah.
And learning that for me was huge. Because when you are not listening to respond and you're really listening to hear what that person has to say, you hear so much more. You hear their body language. How are they sitting? How are they, are they open? Are they maybe closed and cowering? It tells you so much about what they're really trying to get across. Even a deep breath.
Yeah,
Even a deep breath.
I'm just thinking about particular situations.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But also, repeating back to them and saying to them, what I heard you say. Then they know that you've listened to them, but it also gives them an opportunity to correct. Perhaps you got something wrong. No, that's not really what I said, or that's what I said, but that's not what I meant.
I suspect that happens
Often.
Yeah.
Yes, very much.
As people sort through their own process.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
I've found in my marriage particularly, but other places as well. Sometimes just that listening resolves the conflict.
Yes.
Like you don't even have to take other steps. You just, you have that full openness between both, and then all of a sudden the conflict kind of evaporates on its own, because listening is so powerful.
It is incredibly powerful. And what I've found in doing mediations for the last 8 or 9 years, or 10 years maybe,
Wow.
is that in listening, that's usually what the person wants. They don't want you to resolve it for them.
Yeah.
They just
yeah.
want to be heard.
Yeah.
And I think that in today's time, you know, this time that we're living in right now, where it seems like there's so much conflict, sometimes over very small things and sometimes over huge things, to the point where family members aren't speaking to each other. People who've been friends for a lifetime are not speaking to each other. And it hurts my heart when I hear stories like that. Or with Facebook, where we're unfriending people that we've known for ages.
And the poles just keep getting
Farther and
apart.
farther
Yeah.
apart. But really, it's what we really want is to be heard.
Yeah.
And that's why the screaming is getting so loud. And I think if we just took the time to just listen, not pass judgment, not call each other names, but just listen.
Have you watched that? You kind of suggest that, but I guess I don't want to ask more overtly. Since you've been doing this for 10 years, have you seen maybe fuses getting shorter, polarization increasing, and more conflict as a result? Do you see changes, trends maybe? Or?
I do. So in the state of Michigan, there are a total of 18 centers. The resolution centers. And the one major thing we all have in common is that we do mediations. And across the state, approximately 85% of the mediations come to resolution. And I can run statistics specific to our center. And so when we started computerizing everything, statistically we were right on over the years. 85% of the time we were resolving the conflicts. Over the last 5 years, that number has gone down.
Wow.
People are more polarized. They come in and they want to tell us about how the other person is such a bad guy, how they are so wrong, how she doesn't treat me well, and then they want to take it to court. They want to be heard in another step, at another venue, and they don't want to come to resolution. In some instances, that's okay. It perhaps should be taken in front of a magistrate or a judge and have that person make a final decision. But I think sometimes it's because we're becoming so entrenched in our positions and that we don't want to give up. Like we feel like we're giving something up, we're giving up some power, as opposed to just trying to work through the problem.
And these are personal conflicts?
Yes, often personal conflicts between parents or between neighbors. It might be between two business partners. It could be between a business person, a business owner, and say somebody who owes them money for a debt or something along those lines. But to a degree, everything is a personal conflict.
So what's causing the polarization, do you think?
That's a very good question. And I think part of it...
Virtual reality.
Virtual reality. I think some of it is television, you know?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes. I think some of it is I'm right and I know I'm right and everybody has told me I'm right and therefore I'm right.
Because within
our circle.
The bubble of my own
Yes.
affirmations.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or I have also seen a lot of people saying, you should just take this to court. You're going to win if you take this in front of a judge.
Thus we have the Judge Judy and all of those shows.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So that's what they feel like they should do.
It started a long time ago, the notion of suing people. I mean, that's not new in our society, but it did create a kind of attitudinal shift that if something bad happens to you, you just sue.
Yes.
Whether it's a motel owner or your neighbor or the government, or I mean, just that whole
Yes.
notion that I think of it like the no-fault society. Whatever's wrong in my life is not my fault. I'm going to find someone to sue or blame or win over.
And that's why, so Conflict Resolution Services has been in the community for almost 30 years now. 2 years it'll be 30 years. And Tom and Darlene Shea, who helped start Conflict Resolution Services, and a lot of folks who've been around will know Tom and Darlene, they realized how adversarial the legal process was.
Wow.
And how much it took out of folks. I mean, you both have talked about how emotional is just having conflict. So add on that conflict if you go to court and you choose to hire an attorney. And so you have attorney's fees and filing fees, and then you have to take time off court to go to court dates. And the emotions that go with it, if the person that you are suing or taking to court is a family member or a friend or a neighbor or someone you've been doing business with for a number of years, they realized the emotional toll that took on people. And so Tom and Darlene went out and said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And they came across this, what was then a relatively new idea of resolving conflict by sitting people down with a neutral party who didn't have a horse in the race, if you will, and who just really listened.
Does the mediator reflect back what they, or do they just make sure each person has a turn to speak? Or does the mediator try to clarify or?
The mediator actually does all three of those things. So the mediator will listen, the mediator will reflect back, the mediator will clarify, and the mediator also often is looking for places where there's agreement. Because what often happens in conflict is that you are so in conflict you don't realize that you might have agreement. And so one of the tools in my toolbox is I like to use humor in mediation. I find that it helps people relax a little bit. And so we go through this opening process, and there is a confidentiality agreement that we go through. And I will often start out with the parties who come into the mediation, and I'll say, okay, so I would like to be your mediator today, and my name's Becky Rogan, and I don't know either of you, and I just know a little bit about your case. Is it okay with both of you if I'm your mediator? Yeah, sure, okay, we're here, let's do this. And I'm like, great, we have our first agreement. Now, wasn't that easy? They often laugh, but it helps set the tone. And then they realize, okay, maybe we can come to some agreements. And so the mediator will listen for agreements through their discussion. And if it's about child-related issues, we might listen for both of them to say, I really care about my child or my children, and we'll point that out. During your opening statement, your uninterrupted time, you both mentioned how much you cared about your children. And they're like, oh, we really do. They're really important to us, and their well-being is really important to us. Or if it's not about kids and maybe it's about neighbor issues. We often talk about the barking dog case where the dog gets left home alone and there's another neighbor that's there it's home all the time, and they listen to the neighbor's dog barking. And we often talk about the tranquility of the neighborhood. We live here because of the tranquility of where we live, and we love our neighborhood and we love our neighbors. And we don't realize when we're gone that our dog misses us, and they're barking because they're lonely. And, oh yeah, I can imagine being left for 8 hours. I might get lonely, and if I were a dog and that were my way of communicating, I would bark too. And so you find those things where parties can agree. And so that's what they're looking for also.
Yeah. Even in that case, though, it seems to me that the person who owns the barking dog has to be the one to make the advance, you know. And how, I think the challenge in that is, how do you make that person come to that moment of, okay, I have to do something about the dog, you know. And the onus then becomes on that person, as well as you know, there might have to be some compromise, like maybe once a day that dog is going to bark because there's a squirrel out there and you can't do anything about that.
Right.
But what do you see as the way in which a person begins to move?
It's different for each person.
Yeah.
You know, and oftentimes, though, it's the approach, Anne Marie. If you approach somebody, you know, if I approach Karen because her dog is barking and I'm angry and I'm like, Karen, your dog never shuts up, she's going to do exactly what she just did. She's going to shut down. My dog does not bark. Or it doesn't bark 8 hours, or, you know, we live on a busy street, or whatever. She's just going to shut down. And so as a mediator, what you try to do is help them step back and say, so tell me about your schedule during the day. And get them to talk about, I'm not home 8 hours a day. So maybe I don't understand what my dog is doing during the day. Or maybe I don't understand that the way the houses are built, it's a natural amphitheater. So my dog might bark, and the neighbor across the way, it sounds like their dog is right underneath their bedroom window.
Right.
You know, but you just kind of help guide them to those realizations. And for mediators, we try to leave out our presuppositions, but we don't leave out our emotions.
Oh.
And we try to help folks maybe look at it from a different emotion, or a different, not just a different point of view, but how might I feel if I were home? And we were talking earlier, the three of us, about how mediation can be used in a lot of different situations. And one of the things that we were talking about is we are seeing more mediations that involve aging parents.
Yeah.
And in some instances, we have family members who live really close to the aging parents, and other family members who live farther away. And it's difficult for those who are farther away to see how age is maybe taking its course with the parent, and they do need more help. And so part of what the mediator might do is say, you know, so tell me about your interaction with your parents, to the one who lives farther away. And you find out they're calling them between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, but they don't talk to them from 2 until 8 or 9 at night. And that's when the closer party is. And so they're seeing what is sometimes referred to as the sundowners.
Right. Sundowner syndrome.
Sundowner syndrome. And
What is that?
it's in the evenings.
Agitation.
The agitation in the evenings.
Rises at sundown. Or,
Okay.
you know, it rises in the evening.
Right. And so you might say, so what would happen, or would you be willing to maybe call them later in the day? Because what I'm hearing this person say, what I'm hearing Karen say, is mom and dad are more agitated in the evening, and that's when she's saying she needs more assistance. And Anne Marie, I'm hearing you call earlier and saying they're doing fine.
Right, right.
What would happen if you called them later in the evening?
So in that way, one party gathers information that they do not have.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
And oftentimes that is what mediation can be about, is parties gathering information that they don't necessarily have.
Right.
And it
Wow.
sounds so obvious when
Yes.
you're sort of calm and outside the situation.
Correct.
But when you're in it
Yes.
and you're entrenched in your point of view, in your particular, I mean, I have had issues with barking dogs, and
Which is why I was laughing.
Yes.
But one of the common denominators I found that was helpful is that actually we all want to be good neighbors,
Correct.
don't we? I mean, we
Yes.
want to think of ourselves as good neighbors.
Absolutely.
And so that's a place to start. I found that helpful. I know you want to be a good neighbor. I do too.
Yes.
And then that was helpful for me. Like, here's a point of agreement that's pretty substantial. And so it was also helpful to be able to say, there's a place here in Traverse City that we could go and talk about this.
Yes.
And that seemed to be a way of resolving it right there.
Yes.
Not that you were a threat, but you
No.
were a resource. And,
Yes.
you know, oh, okay, there's other ways to manage this.
Yes.
We're going to run out of time pretty soon, but I wanted to be sure to mention, you know, it strikes me that as Anne Marie and I were talking earlier about how we didn't grow up seeing conflict resolution modeled, and that it ought to be part of the curriculum
Right.
in our
Yes.
homes and in our schools.
Or our culture
And-
somehow. Yeah.
And I know I read about it in the paper, and you mentioned it to me earlier, that is it TC West that has an actual conflict resolution program? Tell me a little bit about that.
Traverse City West Senior High School has a program called Peers Making Peace. And I am just so impressed with this program. It's a program that Conflict Resolution Services offers where we go in and we teach students how to be mediators.
Wow.
And
Isn't that
this
wonderful?
program,
That's
these,
amazing.
I know it is, and they have had incredible success with this program. And so these students learned how to be mediators, and they started out mediating issues between other students. And there was just an article in the Record Eagle, so it's safe to talk about this now, but they helped with bringing the Spirit Rock, not the Spirit Rock, but a new Spirit Rock, back to Traverse City West Senior High School, by bringing together students and faculty and administration and saying, you know, this is something that's really important to us, and helping facilitate that conversation and having administration and staff saying, yes, we can do this, how can we make this work?
Wow. Wow.
And these kids are really excited about it. It's my understanding that they've also been going to East Middle School and working with the students there in resolving conflict.
Wow.
And
This is
it's-
so promising.
it is very promising, and these are skills these students can take out into their own lives, into their homes, as they go into college, as they get married. Because you're right, unfortunately, we don't see this being taught in homes. That's why I think we have the conflicts that we do. I mean, there's a whole lot of other socioeconomic issues that go along with this, and it's not a panacea. I'm not trying to paint it that way. But when these kids learn how to listen and how to talk, and we get feedback back from students who've gone through these programs, and we get feedback from adults, and they're saying, I feel like I was listened to for the first time, that I was actually heard, that I had input in how to resolve this problem, where kids are actually staying in school as opposed to maybe going through a disciplinary process that would have them out of school. It's so important to keep these kids in school. They're doing such a phenomenal job, and I am so proud of them. I met with them about 3 weeks ago.
Your energy is lighting
I
up
know,
the studio. I mean,
I'd plug me into a light and I could just light up the room for
Yeah.
you, because it is such a promising program, and we're going to have some statistical information at the end of the school year. I can't wait.
oh, that's great.
Yeah,
You'll have
and
real data.
we'll have real data. We've also done this program with one of Traverse Bay Area Intermediate School District's program, their ACE 2B program, which is students with high functioning autism. And those kids have talked to me about how they take it out into the community, and it's really helped improve their listening skills and even their problem solving skills. Actually, one of the students I know personally, and he gets me every once in a while because he'll come to me and we'll be having this discussion about something, and he'll say, "So Becky, what I heard you say was," and it will, you know, and all of a sudden you're like, Oh yeah, he was listening during that training. So, but
And it all comes
and
back.
It all comes back, and but it is really, it's a phenomenal program, and we hope to get it into
wow.
more schools over the coming school years.
That just
It's
sounds so. I mean, that just sounds so helpful.
It
and
is,
Really,
it is.
really
Great
beautiful.
to wrap up
Yeah.
with a sense of hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
You've brought us so much good information.
Well,
Yeah,
good.
thank
This
you.
is
so
Thank you
helpful.
so
Thank
much
you
for coming
very
on.
much. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
It gives me a lot of confidence in what I and what, as an individual, and what we as a community can do related to conflict. So
I think that's a part of it we haven't talked about, but we should, is what we can do as community
Yes.
using mediation for these bigger gaps.
Yes.
So, thanks so much.
Not a problem. I'd love to come back and talk about building a bigger table sometime.
lots more to talk about.
Lots more to talk about.
Thank you, Becky.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back.
Hello and welcome back. We're having a little debrief on conflict, feeling much more calm and confident about our conflict resolution skills.
Isn't that amazing? Becky just made me feel like, okay, there are real tools.
Yeah.
There are ways to go through that miasma of emotional, that whatever that maze of awful
Shame,
anxiety
fear,
is.
anxiety.
Yeah, that there are ways to work through that we can actually learn and practice.
What are your takeaways on methods and
Well, I think for
strategies?
me, the idea of finding common ground, but in those situations which I have been in where there doesn't seem to be much common ground, making small incremental requests or kind of thought experiments almost of asking a person to imagine what this is like to be in the other person's
okay.
shoes in very small incremental ways. That made sense to me as a way to gradually bring a person to a point where they can say, yeah, maybe that's, maybe I should look at this differently. And then practicing good listening skills. But I think, like you, probably the most impressive thing was the work being done with high school curriculum.
well, it's so hopeful. you know,
Yeah.
that these young people can have a huge head start on people like us who did not see conflict resolution modeled almost in
Right.
any way.
Right.
But just listening to Becky, I think this is what you have said as well. Take some of the fear out of it, because there is fear. There's fear of being wrong, being hurt, of not getting it figured out. My son-in-law said yesterday when we were talking about conflict that he would watch his parents fight and he would feel alarmed, he and his siblings, and they would just say, oh, we still love each other, we're just having a fight. And then he thought, oh, this is okay. See, even
This
just
isn't
that.
the end of the world.
Even
Yes.
just that
Yeah.
is so much better than what I saw, and certainly it can be much better still, thanks to Becky and what we've learned.
Yeah.
So,
What a
Great
what
conversation.
a wonderful conversation.
thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time.
You bet.